Today, I'm going to cover a very interesting subject that's always mentioned, and depending on how old you are, you either have it shoved down your throat that it was a great thing, or you lived in it and you remember it as a great thing. So for one group of you, it's going to be a reminiscent walk, but for the group, it might make some more sense for the very first time in your life as to what us old folks are talking about, and that is a historical walk through one man's journey of the 1980s. I once asked my buddy, my mentor grew up in the 60s, and I said, he would talk to me about the 60s and tell me these incredible stories about the transformation into the hippie era, what that was all about, how it actually grew, as opposed to how it's romanticized, and just incredible tales. And I said, dude, why don't you write a movie about this era? Because I've never heard it told the way you're telling it. And he said, the problem is that kids can't understand what I would write down. It wouldn't mean the same thing because we've been so corrupted as a society from all of our warmongering and our hatred and our bigotry and our drug use and all this stuff that we don't think like that anymore. So it's almost impossible to get people to understand what it was like. And so there's going to be a bit of that for this episode. Again, for those of you who lived in it, I hope to arouse a few wonderful memories for you. But you might ask, why do this, right? Is it just me getting bored of topics? No, not at all. For me, I'm hoping to give a sense of differential between the decade of the 80s and every decade that's followed, and why I think, and to hopefully help the youth of the world understand why maybe their parents, and maybe starting to become their grandparents, have a different vision of why we think today is not so great in some ways. Now, there's a lot of great things going on right now, but we didn't live in the horrendous cycles that we live in today that rob us of opportunity. So obviously, I can only give you my perspective. The nice thing about my perspective is that I lived it to the nines. What I accomplished in the 80s and everything I went through, I think is going to be interesting. Because I started 1980 at 10 years old, and then I got to 1990 at 20 years old. So it's going to be that 10 formative years of a dude who moved around quite a bit. In those 10 years, I lived in 3 different states. So let's get started. Now, before we set up the first year of the 80s, which obviously is 1980, it's good for everyone to understand where America was. And again, this could be more of an American thing. I do know just a tad about Britain during that time, but I don't have any recollection of any other country whatsoever. But the 70s had gotten to a point where, we start the decade out with a war, a tumultuous war that had been going for a while, had no purpose. Kids are getting drafted, so they're getting sucked into war, and they don't want to be there, obviously. They want to pursue their destiny. Of course, there's a lot of patriotic bullshit about Vietnam. That you should just do what your military says, don't ask questions, which is their fantasy to do anything that they want and hurt anybody that they want. Now, as a child in the 70s, I didn't really understand that the Vietnam War was going at all. But by 1975, that stuff was over. And you had this explosion of a new thing called disco. That was the big thing, because you had British rock and American rock that made it all the way through. And as soon as the war was over, you had a major boost in that stuff as well. You had your Van Halens hitting the airwaves. You had Foreigner, Journey, massive bands coming online and really finishing up the whole rock and roll era of the 70s. But then you had your disco stuff, which was, honestly, I would say one of the most, interesting forms of music. It was just so completely different. But it was kicked off by a movie named Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. And so John was a god. He also did Grease, which made him a god. He was on the Welcome Back Kotter show. I mean, the guy was just utterly exploding. Television, you had finished up the era of the Brady Bunch, the Partridge Family. I believe the Jeffersons started in the 70s. I could be wrong. But you had a couple shows that kind of started in the late 70s. But once we cross over into the 90s, to the 80s. The hell decade am I doing here? In my personal life, I had a situation where my parents had divorced in 79. I believe it was the year. And my dad had lived in my hometown for about a year, and then eventually moved to Massachusetts. And so I had like half that year, I believe, with him available, and then the other half I had to go see him in Massachusetts, and I eventually moved there very quickly after that. And I remember that my father was a huge music fan in general. I mean, everything on planet Earth, from, again, the best R&B to the best rock. But he was also really into techno music. Kraftwerk. And if any of you have missed Kraftwerk, and you dig techno, you haven't met your elders yet. Kraftwerk is the inventors of techno music. There's a lot of people who did synth and really cool, genre and a bunch of other stuff. But Kraftwerk was and is the godfather and creator of techno music. So I'm entering this realm, this new decade. And for me, the very first human being that kissed off the 80s, that said, this is where the 80s start, and that's where the 70s ends, was a little British guy named Gary Numan. Gary Numan made a song called Cars. And I think everyone on planet Earth heard Cars. But that song to this very day sounds nothing like anything else that was ever made after it, never made before it. Incredibly amazing hook on this thing. No one knows what the fuck he's talking about. Right? He's hiding in his car. But it was brilliant. And when you hear something so purely different than everything that you've ever heard, and it grabs you, it forces an era change in your heart. It forces the fact that we are now in a different world, because the sound of the song will guide the visual textures of your brain. It literally says, we don't wear those clothes anymore. We wear these clothes. We don't buy that furniture anymore. We buy this furniture. We don't watch movies of this kind. We watch these movies. And that's what, for me, the song Cars did for everyone. And, we also had, right at 1980, we had Empire Strikes Back that came out in 80, I'm pretty sure. And it was the second of an amazing franchise that blew up in the 70s. And nobody had, just so you know, nobody really had any animosity towards the last half of the 70s, right? Last half of the 70s was almost like the last half of the 40s after the war was over the first time in World War II. What you had going into the 80s in terms of fun was, kids, we went down to arcades. And I'm telling you, arcades were... arcades not existing today, and I know there's a handful across America, no T in there, I think it was just one of the most environmentally amazing experiences to get out of your freaking house, to get into this really cool, almost like carpeted, floor-to-ceiling arcade, to go to the arcade. And, the reason why the arcade was cool, other than just socializing with your friends face-to-face, as opposed to all this Facebook bullshit, right? But you'd walk in, and these coin-op machines, I mean, we're talking about, these guys had mastered video game concepts before, just a decade after they'd figured out how to put a pixel on a screen. And these geniuses figured out how to create fictional games, which, again, there's no reference before then. No reference at all. Where there weren't board games that looked like video games. So there was nothing that they were copying. Someone had completely thought up this stuff, and Atari was leading the pack, you know. I think Konami is the other one in Japan. But these guys were ingenious, and so they built these big machines, right, with big subwoofers in them, barely any processor power in them, but they created incredible sounds and had, you know, just the most fundamentally beautiful games out there. And so you walk into these environments, and it's just when you're surrounded by the booms of all these machines, right, you feel like you're in a different world. I mean, you really feel like you're at Disneyland or something, or even better. The other cool thing about an arcade was that you were always bumped into a new machine once a month. Someone was creating a brand new game. And so you'd show up and there's a brand new game and a huge line to play it. And you know, you don't want to put your money in right away because you don't know how to play the game because you don't want to suck. So you sit and watch the guys who are kicking ass, taking names, and try to learn how it works. And then you wait for your turn. Then you kind of suck for a little while. Then you get really good. Then people are watching you, you know. And there was always the throwback area, which was the pinball machines. Pinball machines, which were initially all, you know, mechanical machines, where it was just, you know, capacitors and kickers and bumpers. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, they went digital. And now the pinball repairman had a different lifestyle because the stuff didn't break down very often. He would literally replace just the bumpers, just the physical items, because the processors, they just stayed working forever, you know. Definitely for the life of the machine. Just at the tail end of the 70s, Atari came out with the 2600. If you don't know what that is, just look up Atari 2600, and you'll get reminded very quickly. If you've ever seen one, it'll make sense to you. So that's how we entered the 80s. Fashion had us pretty much stuck in the nerdy discos. Your fashion was lots of polyester clothing, lots of tight pants, a little bit of the bell-bottom action, some of the bell-bottom denim, definitely a lot of bell-bottom polyester. The polyester shirts I used to get in the early 80s were big giant lapels, you know, and it was really slick. You always wanted a slick-colored shirt. Very shiny, very inexpensive because it was so cheaply made. Glasses, well, they were very round, very massive on your face. And it was before anyone realized that, you know, hey, your eye socket doesn't need to be completely covered with a wide projection screen, piece of glass in front of each eyeball. Hairstyles, I think we were just getting out of sort of like the John Denver bowl cut, where you just had bangs. But I entered the 80s with a part down the middle. Actually, I didn't enter the 80s. About 2 years into the 80s, it was part down the middle and feathered back. I don't even know how the hell you do that nowadays. Let's get into some of the interesting stuff, some of the tech. In 1980, I'm going to tell you that almost every house in America and around the world, 99.9% of the population did not own a computer. There wasn't a mouse in your house. There wasn't a monitor in your house. There was no CPUs. If your folks did their accounting, they had a little adding calculator with a paper ribbon that came out at the top. In terms of being a child, well, you had your music and you had your toys. That's pretty much it. You play a 45, a 33, which for you really young kids, you know, it's a piece of wax. Not like a candle. It's actually thicker and heavier than that. But because it was smaller, you had to play at a higher velocity, right? So it turns 45 rotations per minute. Your 33 turned 33 times per minute. Put your little needle down. Everybody had turntables. The big deal with a turntable was that you had to preserve the needle because they were like $50, and that was a big deal back then. When you bought your album, it sounded perfect when you first took it out of the sleeve and you put the needle down. You barely got any artifact sounds because it was clean as a whistle. And every single time you played it, you scratched it a little bit. And so the more that you played your album Every single place you would drop the needle in the past had a little tick in it. So if you ever hear those scratchy ticks, it's because that's an artifact of every single time a little diamond needle was put down on the wax. Used to have album stores where you had to go buy vinyl. No one called it vinyl back in those days. We just called them LPs, albums, whatever. At least I don't remember anyone calling them that. What was cool about your vinyl is that you had the option of getting just a regular LP, which had 10 to 12 tracks on it. They didn't do 20-track albums back then. You could get a double album, which was joined at the center. It's like a book. And I remember my Kiss Alive albums, Kiss Alive and Kiss Alive 2, amazing. The Grease album that most kids my age had, double album. You would also buy an album, and one of the things you would do it just like when you bought cereal back in the day as a kid. You had a toy in the bottom of the cereal. Which, I mean, think how brilliant that is, right? You have to get to the bottom of the cereal to get your toy, which means eat up, kids, because mommy's going to go buy you some more. But when you bought an album, every once in a while there was a poster in the album. And what was cool about that is that you didn't pay extra for the album. It just had a free poster in it. It was awesome. I can't remember which, because I used to buy posters as well. So you go to the record store, and they had a little poster section, with this little sort of a bunch of frames of posters. Used to have these Atari records as well. I think Hot Topic still has them, and a few other places have them. I remember when I bought Controversy by Prince in 1982, 81, I guess. It had a poster of Prince in the shower. I thought, like, what am I looking at this for? It's just weird. So I had no sexuality at that level in my mind. It looked gay. So I was like, not for me. It's one badass album, I'll tell you that much, though. So we started this era, again, with no computers. Beta, which was the way that we actually recorded things from television and played it back, these little tiny tapes. Any of you have seen a VHS tape? Well, it's about 2/3 the size of VHS with better picture quality. Purely a Sony construct, right? Cars. Well, the hottest car in town, I think in America, was probably the Corvette Stingray. Although the Corvette Stingray was getting a little crazy with its fins. In 1983, they debuted this brand new Corvette, which lasted 25 years and bored the living hell out of all of us. I think it damn near lasted 30 years. But the last 82 Corvette had gigantic fins on it. I have to say, when the Corvette came out in 83, I think the models technically may have been 84s, but I saw it in Epcot Center in 83. It was considered a spaceship. It was considered one of the coolest things ever, and I got a chance to drive the piss out of one of them in 86. Now, for me in 1980, I moved to Massachusetts. And that was an interesting culture shock. I mean, I had been around the United States quite a bit as a kid. And I'd even visited Massachusetts before. But living there was a definite big change for me. But as it relates to the 80s, I had these significant moments in my life that really, I think, call out to the 80s. The 80s turned over, and you had this kind of a British invasion of punk rock. Unbeknownst to most American kids, Britain in the 70s was going through this huge sort of rejection of the aristocracy, the banking, homogeny that was over there, because they were getting crazy taxes, almost like 90% plus taxes, and it was just out of control. And so this group of kids essentially worked extremely hard to radicalize themselves. So they physically were repulsive to the aristocracy and normal average citizens of Britain. That's where you get your mohawks, your facial tattoos, if you look at what was it, Vivian on The Young Ones, he would put these general stars in his forehead. It was crazy. It was anything you could do. A lot of military clothing, a lot of jeans and military combat boots, just anything that looked hideous. And so in the Midwest in Kansas, where I was initially stationed in the 80s, there was none of that. Nobody would dare walk around like that. And we just didn't feel the need to do it, right? We weren't under the lock and key that the British citizens were under, but they felt like they needed that, you know? So when I got to Massachusetts, I finally started seeing a bit of that. And it looked cool as hell. I mean, I just couldn't even imagine being that way myself, but it was interesting. But you had bands that crossed over. They got really, really famous. Sex Pistols being one of them. Now, see, the Sex Pistols were interesting because they essentially stayed a punk rock band. To this very day, in 2016, they're still a punk rock band. Now, you know, we've lost several. Sid Vicious, we've lost, and I think a couple of other members, but the lead singer dude, whose name escapes me, who was actually way ahead of his time in terms of knowing how the society works. Still around. Just saw an interview with him. But one of the other musicians that crossed over from absolute punk was a guy named Adamant, who's still around to this day, and in fact, he's looking great right now. Adamant, like Gary Numan, had a sound all of his own. Adamant and his band, whose name, his guitar player is very, very important. But Adamant was a punk rocker that had dual drums, which I thought was just the coolest thing on earth. Two full drummers, full kits, playing just about, an eighth of a step or 16th of a step out of sync. And so instead of going boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, they would play it rum, ba boom, ba rum, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom. So it sounded like this crazy, almost pirate army. And his whole gimmick, which was so well done, you just don't want to say the word gimmick, but his special thing was he made pirate music. Pirate punk music. And it sounded like you're on the frickin' deck of a pirate ship. And it was cool. And it was, most of it was, I think, fairly manly. His lyrics were actually very touching and kind of reached into the history of the world. He even pays a lot of respects to Native Americans. He wore a little bit of eye makeup and a little bit of face makeup, put some face paint on his bridge of his nose and his cheeks, which kind of made him look cool. He wore a lot of pirate outfits, pirate clothing and stuff. He also had just kind of a smidgen of Native American stuff on him. It was very interesting. Now, looking back on that era, when you see these guys on stage, a bit like when I'm going to get into the metal side of things here, there was, you have to remember there was disco in the 70s. And the thing that kids don't understand today, because we're so hard, we've been so exposed to negativity, was that man was not convinced to be as macho as they are today. And so guys were happy. People were happy in general. Because we didn't have, global terror like we do today. And so in the disco era, you had, again, late 70s, you had skating rinks, which were gigantic. And so you had, Who Dropped a Bomb on Me, playing and by the Gap Band. And you skated forwards and backwards, and people were just happy. Thrilled to be out of a war. Watching our relatives come home with PTSD and nobody knew what the hell that was, right? So we were so relieved to be out of this 15-year war, out of this military-industrial complex, sort of, anal retentive, emotionless men from the 60s, right? Because in the 60s is where we opened up consciousness. With LSD, they opened up consciousness. And then, of course, mid-70s, we got our cocaine, right? So when you see like an Adamant, you're going to see a dude jump around, and he looks feminine sometimes. And you have the song I think that he regrets ever writing is called Goody Two Shoes. His bank doesn't regret it, but I think he personally doesn't like to perform that particular one on stage because I think that's a big request every time he goes out. And he grew out of that whole thing as well. I saw him perform at the Fillmore in 1994, and he looked fantastic. He looked exactly like he did in the 80s, but looked a little more manly, right? and they played their whole catalog, and they played it in almost a Trent Reznor style. It was just absolutely badass the way he made this thing. I even hate to use that word because it's overused these days, but it sounded amazing. And then there was a moment where he had to do Goody Two Shoes, and you could tell in his face he didn't want to do it. And he didn't jump around like a silly schoolgirl. He just sat there in front of the mic. But in 1981, I bought the album Kings of the Wild Frontier. I never got a chance to buy Gary Numan's album, which is interesting. It was always on the radio. But I also remember Pat Benatar popping out for all the chicks. And let me tell you, man, she owned the female rock scene. Now, the other big thing that started happening in 1981, for me personally, I've talked about this from time to time, but I think it's important within the spectrum of the 1980s, for those of you who didn't live fully conscious in the 80s to understand this. I got on my first computer. Now, I had seen computers in the late 70s, early 80s, but you didn't touch them. They were grown-up things, right? I've told the story a long time ago, but I won't belabor it too much here. But I came home from Massachusetts to visit my grandparents in Kansas for a summer. My uncle's got a computer in the living room, and he is programming a video game, and I'm watching him, and it's blowing my mind. I am totally and utterly infatuated with arcade games. One, because I'm so young, I don't make my own money, and so getting to play them is borrowing money from your parents. My parents weren't really hip on giving me money to push into a machine they didn't understand themselves. But my uncle was making this lunar lander game, which many of you played the game, but it's like a little lunar module, and you have to fly it and control its thrust, and you have to land at a certain speed, otherwise you die, and if you touch the side, you die. It was just a brutal game. It's very entertaining, very punishing, right? So he's doing this, and I don't really know how he's doing it. I'm seeing source code with numbers in it. It's on a Texas Instruments 994A computer, which was released in the late 70s. Bill Cosby was the guy that promoted it. And so, I don't know how things progressed, but he ended up going to the next game. And he was calling it like a Wolf Hunt or something like that. And it may have been Fox Hunt or something like that. But it was essentially, you're an animal in the center of the screen. He randomly plots a few trees, and then he randomly plots the wolves, and you have to move and get yourself to safety. And every time you move, everything does what we call an A-star algorithm and tries to get close to you and close to you and close to you. But you can use the trees as obstacles to, delay them getting to you while you escape. But this time he didn't have the artwork ready. And so he sat me down at the kitchen table, gave me some grid paper, taught me how to count in binary, and said, okay, you're going to draw these trees, and you can only do blocks of 1 by 4. So imagine just 4 blocks. And he goes, it's either going to be on or it's going to be off. I will handle the color. Okay, so I drew the foxes and I drew the trees, and you had to stack up these blocks. So if you wanted to be 8 across, you had to do 2 4s and stack them up. And they were 4 by 4 blocks. And so you just had to work in 4 by 4 binary blocks, and so I'd hand in the numbers, he'd type them all in, and boom, it was on the screen. It was phenomenal. I was like, I helped make a video game. I learned how to count in binary. It was cool. It was like, I think I was technically 11, I guess. But that really opened my mind. And again, you have to understand, no average kid had a computer in their house, let alone an adult to teach it to them, So, I went back to Massachusetts. Then I saw my computer at school, and I was like, I know how to talk to those things. Now, culturally, another device came out in that era. And, right now, I'm trying to think of the most socially interesting things that occurred in this era of the decade so that I don't miss them, The Intellivision came out, which was another kind of Atari 2600 replacement. And the Intellivision was very interesting. Home entertainment system. You had this unit, and you pull out your controls, and they all had wires, and nothing was wireless, right? So you had this big wire going back to the unit. But the Intellivision was interesting because you had this this disc that you could turn with your finger, a bit like the iPod in the late, the 21st century, right? With this thing, you would turn it and lean it, and your thing on your screen would do something different. They also had a number pad, like a telephone, and you had when you bought a game, it came with a couple plastic inserts, and you would slide this plastic insert over the number display, and all of a sudden your control was customized for the game. Like today you would think of your iPhone screen simply updating to be the game that you're playing. Well, this was the old way of doing it. You slid the plastic insert over it, and then you had your disc. And so the game would sort of physically transform to make you feel like you're in that environment, whatever that was. A battleship game. They had a great game called, I think, Utopia, where you would actually do a Sims type game. And so it was, and then the graphics were all of a sudden way better than the 2600. And the big deal about the about the Intellivision was that if you were to have a character moving and running in an Atari 2600, you'd have essentially a really crude stick figure character that wouldn't actuate his arms or his legs. He'd just be kind of moving around, full frontal. In Intellivision, artists had, they had like the feet running and they actuated the body. And so it was cool. I mean, it was super cool. And the first game that they made that really used this up was a year later when TRON came out. They had made a couple games for TRON. And TRON was this mind-blowing movie because you had not only someone, computers are barely in the lexicon of mankind, right? I guess some of you had owned, Apple 1s and 2s at the time. But it was so rare that, none of my friends owned any of that stuff because it was expensive as well, It was mainly schools and businesses had these kind of things because the only people that could afford it. But TRON comes out, and it's not only, hey, there's computers, but this movie's about a guy that goes inside of a computer and lives in the computer and meets programs and does all this stuff. And so when you're done with the film, you're really not done with the universe. And so here comes this video game, TRON, Mesotron, I think it was, and you got to live in the world and run through this maze and collect things, and it was just freaking cool. So you had this huge advancement in the understanding of computers. Now, in terms of products for kids, I'm trying to think of other products for kids that really changed my life at the time. I should say this much. The average household had a television, probably about 15 to 20 inches tops, big tube televisions, big cases on them, and you had on the side, you had certainly your channel changer. I lived in Massachusetts and Kansas, and in the early 80s, the only channels you had were about 3 or 4 channels. It was the major networks, and that was it. There were no other networks. There was no CNN, HBO came a little bit later. MTV came a little bit later. And so you could only watch just sort of the basic stuff that was on television. It was really horrendously bad. But your channel changer had, hundreds of channels. And I know in the major cities that they had a lot of local networks and stuff, but we didn't have any of that stuff where I lived. I do remember being in Massachusetts and being able to watch Saturday Night live. And the first time I ever discovered Prince, the artist, I believe was in 1980. And I think you can look it up because, one, I think you can look up nowadays pretty easily his first performance. He just did one song. He did Party Up, and I thought it just sounded cool as hell. This different kind of tough R&B. But that particular episode of Saturday Night Live, they had replaced all the original comedians, and people really didn't like the show much. But I'm staying up late for any reason whatsoever. And the guy said the F-bomb at the end. Because at the time, we had this show on TV called Dallas. And Dallas had a gigantic cliffhanger that the main guy named Dallas, which was Larry Hagman's character, was shot. And we didn't know if he died, and we didn't know who shot him. And they took us out over a complete summer. And it was just, boy, everybody's on the edge of their seats. Who shot this guy? And so in this first episode of SNL, they had one of the characters play Dallas. And this comedian was actually in Dumb and Dumber as the bad guy. He's since committed suicide. But at the very end of Saturday Night Live, if you've ever seen the show, at the very, very end, about 1 o'clock, or 5 minutes till 1, they all get on the stage together, and the host will say thank you to the music act that night, and thank you to the cast and crew. Had a great time, and they play their traditional song, and they end the show. Well, they had this dude, in addition to all that, and Prince is on there with his band from his what's going to release the next day, their Controversy album, the very next day. It was all planned out beautifully. They lean down to this guy and say, this actor who's in a gurney, because he got shot in one of the episodes, and they said something like, "Are you going to be okay?" or something like that. I should look this up on YouTube. But the guy is smoking a cigarette on stage, which we could still do back in those days, I guess. And he said, "I just want to know who the fuck did it." And I'm sitting in Massachusetts, right? There's no delay. And I'm looking at the screen like, whoa, there's a guy cussing on TV. Because you didn't hear that very often, right? And everybody was like a split second, like, oh, ha, 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 not a big deal. And then everyone looked at the camera like, oh my God, he just said the F-bomb on television. I remember watching Des Dickerson, I think, is the guitar player at the time, and his face, he looks at the camera like, uh-oh. The guy was fired that night. Lost his whole career. Trying to pull off a stunt to get himself noticed. He got himself fired. I could only assume that was the first nail in that dude's coffin, right? Next day, Prince releases Controversy and Sexuality video back to back. My dad ends up recording it on the beta while I'm asleep. He says, "Oh, you liked that guy last night on SNL. I got 2 videos of his. Bing, converted for life. Converted at least till 1996 when everything kind of got crappy." So Prince was on the scene. Very next year, he drops 1999, which utterly blew our minds. And the funny thing was, I thought that Prince couldn't play any instruments. Really funny. Because I'd always see him play his guitar for a split second and just throw it behind his back. And I was used to Eddie Van Halen. I was used to incredible artists that always played their stuff. And I thought, this guy isn't playing anything. He's just a front man. Wrong. Prince played absolutely every single instrument I had heard to date, giving up maybe a guitar solo one here and there, but the dude played 30 instruments, and that's why he was amazing, right? I come back to Massachusetts to finish up the last year of my life there, and I'll just tell you a couple little relics that I remember. One of my fondest memories, and I don't even know what the hell this thing's called, is a food item that became extremely popular on the East Coast. And it's worth mentioning because some of you may have remembered this, and I do not remember what the hell they're called. And it was just a diabetes machine making amazing concoction. And it was these little, you bought them in a plastic wrapped kind of, almost like you would buy rolls for Thanksgiving. It has a little tiny cardboard base, and it was all blister packed on top. So this had a lot of artwork on it. But it was a little pillow thing, and it must have been maybe a 3-inch square, maybe an inch thick. And this was it was a pastry, and it was unbelievably made. It's like when you take the dough and you pound it out, and then you fold it on, and you put some sugar on it, and then you put some butter on, and then you fold it again. It's just like a regular French pastry thing. But these things had like a whipped cream in them with all kinds of fruit flavors. You could get, blueberries and strawberries. Like strawberries is the one that we really like the most. My friend's mother would get these things by the crate. And none of us were fat at all. But you bit into one of these things, and it was a sugar explosion in your mind. If there ever was a reason to be addicted to something, this particular dessert was mind-blowing. And they didn't have it in Kansas at all. The other interesting thing, food item-wise, was that in Kansas, Mexican restaurants, and even to this very day, if you come to America, if you're not from here, or if you're on the coasts, and this is starting to kind of take effect 25 freaking years later, the Mexican restaurants in the Midwest have something called cheese dip. and it's just a bowl with cheese in it. And it's not just regular cheese melted down. You just can't just take a block of cheddar and melt it down because it's oil and a bunch of stuff. But they used to make it with government cheese, which actually was very delicious when I was a kid. But they mix all kinds of stuff in it. They'll mix a little bit of the oil from making chips in it. They'll, I don't even know. It's like an ancient Mexican secret, right? Used to have a couple restaurants in my hometown, and they put meat in it sometimes. You can get one with meat in it, one with extra meat in it, and you dip your chip in it, and they take the meat and they boil it. So they boil off all of the fat. And so you don't have fat or you don't have grease, and so you just have cheese and meat. It's not exactly great for your gut or anything. But my father was addicted to cheese dip. And so we had convinced one of the restaurants that was closing down to give us the recipe of how this is made. And so we would fix this for friends in the East Coast, and they would freak out. You know, they sold the chips already, and they sold all the ingredients. No one had just put it together yet. And there's an interesting story in the 90s where I ate so much of this stuff when I moved here, I actually rotted my gut. I just ate too much cheese. Haven't had cheese dip in ages. It's just utterly bad for you these days. But so that was one of the items that we brought. But my father was a military man, so we spent a lot of time on military bases. I don't think anything is very specific about that in terms of the 80s. Cars. Cars were going through sort of a transformation out of the 70s. You know, your typical super 70s looking vehicles were your Pacers, your Gremlins. You know, you had your muscle car era pretty much die in about 1975, 76. When you look at the Dodge Charger, that was sort of the General Lee looking Dodge Charger, to the one I ended up driving in high school, 76 Dodge Charger. It looked like a Cordoba. So we were sort of losing the beautiful love affair with cars in terms of manufacturers making anything that was interesting. If any of you want to see sort of the pinnacle of early 80s cars, go look at the K car. That's where society was. Absolutely boring car. The K car, if you haven't seen one, you've already seen one and you've already drawn one. If you're a little kid and you're drawing a square-shaped car, you have drawn a K car. That's how utterly pathetic this thing was. And you'd see them all over the place, and it was just horrendously boring looking. About 83, I moved back to Kansas. So I'm 13. I had failed 7th grade, as I've said before. And it was crazy. 7th grade was more complicated than every other grade I've ever taken in my life, in high school and everything. So for those who support Common Core, you know, part of it's just making sure that the schools didn't radically change the difficulty. I think there was a problem to fix, but Common Core was absolutely the last way to do it, right? Common Core says, okay, where's the dumbest kid in this class? Okay, we're going to make all the classes work for that kid. So no one learns anything and nobody fails. You know, that's what Common Core is in America today. But I get back, and a few things have already started. I get back to Kansas, and there was 2 huge revolutions going on in the music industry, and then one in the computer industry that I think are worth mentioning. You had, in 1982, a couple things occur in the music industry. You had rap from Run DMC begin. Now, you also, so rap existed before Run DMC. I do know that, right? But the stuff that was coming out of the 70s, like Rapper's Delight and stuff, was really the first time we'd ever heard a really good disco-y rap. And the first, Rapper's Delight was, I think, 13 minutes long. Most people can't stomach listening to the whole thing nowadays. You had Red Alert and, gosh, you just had a bunch of folks, Grandmaster Flash. But without Run DMC really putting it into a realm where everybody had accessibility to it, sort of a crossover rap that white people could get into easily. And believe me, plenty of people did Rapper's Delight. I was in a military family at the time with my dad. And what ended up happening was that when the guys marched during basic training, they'd always have these, chants they would do. Well, it started becoming Run DMC raps. And I remember the very first time I saw on a bass these guys doing a rap, there was an old tune called It's Like That, and that's the way it is, And that's how they do their normal chants. It teaches you how to march in unison, teach you how to, group think and a bunch of other stuff. But they would turn it over to this one dude who would start the rap. And they would just do bits and pieces of it and stuff. When I saw that, I was like, oh my God, this thing's changing, man. This is kind of cool. It's very modern now, right? So Run DMC starts, but you also have a band called RATT, R-A-T-T. My good friend is the drummer for that. And they were ushering in Out of the Cellar. You had also, in the same era, Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil. And so you had this new 80s metal, sort of like what they call glam rock, Glam, just in case you don't know, is because the guys started dressing like chicks. Really poofy hair. Not just long hair, but poofy hair. Dudes wore a lot of makeup. Now, you already had Adamant wearing some makeup, but his game was completely different than everyone else. Adamant will, if he lives another 100 years, will be one of the most original musicians on planet Earth. No one will copy Adamant. It's just not possible without directly plagiarizing what he did, which is cool. So we had that explosion. We also had, 1 year later, 1984, a movie called Breakin that came out. And if you ever want to see something interesting, there's a documentary on the film company that made Breakin', and the name escapes me right now, but if you look up the Breakin' and look up the film company and then take that name and put it into Netflix, you'll see one of the most entertaining movies on a crazy film company made out of these two Israeli guys. And if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have the true mass understanding of breakdancing. But breakdancing comes and it absolutely supercharges rap music. And one of the greatest raps that ever came out in America was called Jam On It. I think it's like Nucleus Records or something like that. All they did was like a couple songs, and they did like an extended version of Jam On It. The one that released is, I think, the best version. Slightly cut down. They cut it down beautifully. Just a couple verses missing from the original. You had Egyptian Lover, and then you had Kraftwerk, that band I was telling you about. They had come out with, they're pioneering techno music in general, but they had come out with their album called Tour de France. And if you ever want to hear the real, probably first total inceptive commercial album that it was techno, go listen to Kraftwerk's Tour de France. Kraftwerk also came out, I believe, in 1980, right at the cusp, with the band with an album called Numbers. And it's got a, I think that's the name of it. Either it's that or Computer Love or something like that. But it's a computer terminal with their faces on the front. The album is yellow, and the terminal's gray, and their faces are on the front. But that is where you have Sir Mix-a-Lot, which came much later in the 80s. He took a lot of that particular album and turned it into his music. For those of you who like Coldplay, they stole their very first track from Kraftwerk. I even forgot what the hell they ended up calling it, but I believe it was Computer Love, I think was the song they stole it from. Yeah, I think that was it. But they completely lifted the Kraftwerk song. It's Coldplay's first hit, right? They lift it, and they change the lyrics, and they do a great job doing it. And there's nothing wrong with lifting someone else's song and putting your lyrics on it and reprising it and making it happen. Now, this is what I heard written in a magazine. I read it in a magazine that they approached Coldplay and said, we realized that you didn't write this song. This is a Kraftwerk song from 1980. And not the lead singer, but one of the band members was quoted as saying, and again, they misquote people all the time, so I don't mean to offend anybody if this wasn't the case, but what I read in this magazine was, they said the big complaint was, why didn't you credit them in your album? And I don't own a Coldplay album. I will never own a Coldplay album, right? But they said, you didn't credit this band. And the dude supposedly said, I think it was Rolling Stone magazine or something, they said, why should we credit an old, dumb German band for our song? We made this song, they didn't make this song. You never heard, it was never a household song until we made it, remade it, and made it our song. Really? Really? If that's true, I don't know if it's true, but if that's true, you don't get a more entitled generational comment than something like that, right? Hats off to them for making a great song. That they're exclusively female audience likes, but Kraftwerk invented techno music. Invented it. There's very few moments in time where you can say this band created this sound. We don't know what musician created classical music. We don't, but we know exactly who created techno music, right? Autobahn, go look at it. It's 1976. Lots of techno stuff going on that era. Synthesized music going on there, but nothing techno. No one really trying to create amazing beats out of synthesizers, without using a drum. You're talking about 808 sounds invented by this band, 909 sounds invented by this band. They were just the bomb, right? So I think that was kind of funny. So in '84, this thing comes out called Breakin, and it was all set here in Venice Beach, California. And if you watch it, it's a goofy movie. Part of the goofiness was that they cast this girl in the movie who's this jazz hands dancer. Now, when you looked at it, it was sort of a contrast between traditional dance, which every girl in high school and junior high was taking lessons for, with the big, it's essentially like flash dance, right? So the whole Maniac scene out of flash dance, that's really where society was at the time. Sort of an interesting pop rock music genre that was coming out of the 80s here in the States. And what Breakin did was try to balance the two worlds to open up the demographic. They wanted little girls to see it for the jazz hands lady, and they want all of us kids to see, those boys to see it for the actual breakdancing. And they had some of the best breakdancers in the world in this movie. One of the black sidekick guys, they called him Turbo in the movie, and I forget what his real title was in real life. I just recently saw the making of that through this other documentary I'm telling you about. But that kid was amazing. That kid had every technique known to man completely mastered. And in LA, we have the Electric Boogaloo, which is a group of guys that were the best breakdancers, I think, on planet Earth. Electric Boogaloo, I think up until recently, still did shows in Vegas where these guys are in their 40s and 50s do breakdancing still, and it's mind-blowing. Like, you go look up Electric Boogaloo parties or whatever on YouTube. Unfortunately, a lot of them were shot in the 90s with really bad cameras, and so you get really grainy shots. But one of the best rappers, one of the best breakdancers on planet Earth is a guy named Poppin' Taco, and you'll see him in Captain EO. If you ever go to Disneyland and see the Michael Jackson show, he's one of the robots that pops out of one of the pillars, and it gets transformed by Michael Jackson and dances behind him. It's this Latino kid. He's just one of the best on planet Earth. Poppin' Pete, I don't think he was in that, but these amazing guys were all there and all in that film. You also saw the debut of Ice-T, the rapper, and in Breakin' he just kills it. Right now, Breakin' 2 was sort of a big joke. They completely screwed it up, and it's only worth watching to make fun of from start to finish. And even Ice-T did it to take the money, but they even put handcuffs on him, pretty much culturally speaking, which is why by 1987 when he came out with Rhyme Pays, he changed the game. 6 a.m, all that. But 1982, just to jump around, just to finish up, you had Prince releasing 1999, which had the title track, which was amazing. Plus it had Little Red Corvette, which was amazing. And these things started dominating. Well, the Motley Crue keeps pumping out the albums. RATT keeps pumping out the albums. You started getting into this huge glam rock thing. Now, from the British invasion side of things, we got things like Spandau Ballet coming in, which now I know because of this documentary. That sounds a little scary saying that I know something because of a documentary, but Spandau Ballet comes in from Britain, and they had been creating their own clothing. They got out of this punk rock thing, and they got into this sort of really like panel clothing, like a crazy overlapping clothing for no reason, sort of the baggier pants, where you eventually gets up to the Hammer days of the 1988-89 era. But you have this British rock thing, and you have this glam rock thing all at the same time. So British pop, I should say, and then this glam rock thing with rap, just sort of kind of wiggling in between, you know? Now, Prince was off on his own. Prince was in his own world, you know. What I didn't know till later was that Gary Numan pulled out of the rock business because he got too famous too quickly. It freaked him out. And, you know, I kind of have hats off to him. You know, he did create a tremendous amount of music before he quit, but he simply just didn't like to get that much fame on him. Now, you did have a lot of traditional rock from the 70s pop out. You know, Journey kept cranking out albums like crazy. Boston cranked out albums. Chicago cranked out albums. So you did have a lot of the sort of older generation from the 70s continuing to blast out albums. You know, Van Halen absolutely, utterly dominated the at least the early 80s with Hot for Teacher and that kind of stuff. Television, we got MTV. And MTV had music videos. And so we were able to engage and live in this ecosystem of musicians, unlike you do today. And I don't mean to short out any, because kids do get addicted to their DJs now, probably very similarly that we did in the 80s, but we had no other game in town, you know? Like in the 80s, in the Midwest at least, where I lived, your pastimes were essentially go to school, come home. If you had a job, you worked that job for 3 to 5 hours at night, get your paycheck. As a minor, you had to find someone in the town to buy you your booze. You, in my hometown, without the internet, and again, I consider this to be almost a totally euphoric stage of existence because it was social, it had its challenges, it had its rewards, but we would go down to Main Street in my little hometown, Chanute, Kansas, Chanute, which is the center of Google Maps, depending on which version you're running. One, because one of the kids in my high school helped develop that product. You would drag Main Street, just like the 50s, and you pass people in cars. You'd see the girl that you liked, and every single time you passed her, you'd try to throw out a little hint that you liked her, or you'd have your friend tell her on one of the passes that you liked her. So the next time you passed her, she knew you liked her, and it was just this really cool environment. Essentially, the pathetic thing that is the Facebook feed that is fake in terms of you actually interacting with your friends was real. And you really got to the point where you pass a car a couple times and then you pull over on Main Street. You find it, go to the gas station, you got to gas up, you got to get more smokes or more mixers for your booze, and you'd pull over and talk. The cops in our hometown, actually, I didn't realize this, were buying a lot of the booze for the girls. I used a paramedic from the hospital to buy me my booze. He was also an importer of Corona beer before it was ever distributed in the United States of America. So he'd go south of the border, get cases and cases of this stuff, and then bring it over and sell it to us for ungodly amounts of money. Like in 85, I was paying $20 for 6 bottles. So I got my drinking out of the way really early. Fuzzy Navels was the other big deal. Peach schnapps. And I guess orange juice or something. I wasn't really good at drinking much because I'd always end up puking at night. It was crazy. It's funny because I did a whole episode on alcoholism, and when I would puke, I don't think I had the hangover the next day because I just get really wasted, come home, barf my guts out, couldn't stand it, learn my lesson a little bit. Never really got into marijuana. My marijuana started when I was 9. My neighbor would. His brother would cook it in the in the oven. He cooked brown weed, which was really nice. Brown weed had a really different taste than any of this chronic shit that's out there today. And you could smoke it and you would get just mildly high. It was really nice. It wasn't like totally out of control high. And now it's like, how high can you get? It's kind of sad. They don't sell brown weed anymore. I didn't touch weed until I was in my late 20s. Well, actually, not completely true. I'll finish up the 80s and you'll get a little story. But Prince then did something that no one will forget. In 1983, he releases an album called Purple Rain. And what you kids need to understand about the 80s is that sometimes something happens and it dominates the entire decade. And this is what no longer happens anymore. You have your traditional 70s rock that kind of penetrated into the 80s, which again is more of like your Foreigners, Van Halen's, even Led Zeppelin did really well. And then you have your glam rock, which is your Motley Crues, your RATTs, eventually turned into Cinderella, Poison, Wasp, all these credible bands. And I'm missing a ton, and I apologize. You had rap bands starting to come out. You had Run DMC comes out. You got Curtis Blow, who came out of the 70s, making a few bands. You had the Fat Boys that popped out. But you had this movie, and I believe it was 84, 85, 86, somewhere in there. Maybe it's 86. It's called Crushed Groove. Crushed Groove comes out. And we get the introduction of really the Fat Boys for everybody, and you got LL Cool J, who did Radio, just a small audition of Radio in that movie. And he was born, and he utterly dominated rap. After he came out, it was a different game. More lyrics in a song than ever. What Eminem was to the 90s, LL Cool J was to the 80s in terms of really becoming the Mozart that sped it all up, right? They recently did a survey of all the rappers that have ever existed and measured the amount of vocabulary that each individual rapper uses, and LL Cool J outranked Eminem in terms of vocabulary, unique vocabulary used in all of his raps, which I thought was interesting. There's only a couple guys over LL, LL keeps his stuff pretty simple. It's weird. Prince comes out with Purple Rain, the album, and very shortly after that, Purple Rain, the movie. Now, I personally cannot watch Purple Rain, the movie, to save my soul, and I was one of the biggest Prince fans on planet Earth. I was fans of everything, right? But he comes out with that album, and it utterly dominated the 80s, at least the center of the 80s. There wasn't a human being on planet Earth that didn't know who Prince was. He did extremely well. Now, Michael Jackson's also kicking ass, because I believe in 82, he comes out with the Thriller album. I could have that year wrong. But, Thriller was a world record album, because out of 10 tracks, all 10 went to the top 10, which is phenomenal, right? Thriller being the big, spooky, $1 million video he did with, I think, Landau shot it for him. So you have this amazing thing going on. You have Michael Jackson at the peak of his career, Prince at the peak of his career, glam rock at the peak of its entire existence, rap being invented in front of your face, the older bands from the 70s hitting their absolute strides, right? Journey creating music in the 80s that was phenomenal. You had movies after movies after movies that were mind-blowing. Everyone, every single year, had to go to 3 to 4 movies, the way that everyone had to see Avatar when it came out, where your friend grabs you, says, dude, you got to see this is amazing. That happened 3 or 4 times a year. And so when we talk about it being super exciting to exist in an era, okay, that was massive, When the, this is going to sound funny considering what I look like, right? When Breakin came out, and then Beat Street came out right after that. Beat Street was no comparison at all. Beat Street was sort of dark, and it was sort of the Bronx, and I don't think the Midwest was ready for that. Everybody loved palm trees and beaches and bright things and happy people, and Beat Street was really raw. It was probably more close to reality, at least for those folks. But I started learning how to breakdance. Every kid did who was a teenager, right? So on one realm, I'm listening to Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin in my house, but the other realm, I'm listening to Egyptian Lover, Jam on it, and I became a really good breakdancer. The poppin' part, I'd get on the ground, and I've actually hurt my shoulder a long time ago as a kid, jumping down on a mat in front of the Bank of Commerce. But I would make about $100 a week breakdancing after school, just on the main street. People would give us money and stuff, and I got good enough that Walmart came to me before I worked for them, and this is when Sam Walton owned the place. I don't even know how this happened. I don't know. I can't remember who said what to who, but somebody came up to me and said, Walmart wants to pay you to dance at their store so they can pump all this, the jumpsuits, pump the music, and pump, movies like Breakin, which I hit VHS. I'm like, okay. And they go, hey, do you have anyone else that would do it with you? And I had a whole crew, but they were all pretty young. And I don't know why I didn't grab the crew, because we were all really good. But I grabbed this guy who was new, and he wanted to be involved in it. And I said, cool, you want to do this? He's like, yeah, let me get me in there. And so I give them his name and my name, and they print it in the newspaper that we're going to be breakdancing at Walmart. And his mother calls me up, and she is furious that I put her son's name in this thing. I don't know if she's some Baptist who thinks if you dance, it's like screwing standing up or something. I don't know what her freaking problem was. But she was like, my kid's not being down. You misadvertise. I'm going to sue you. I'm like, God damn, lady. You're like, you're on a different planet of fucking reality, right? So I said, fine. Don't have your kid come down. Don't have him have a little moment of fame, right? So I go down by myself, and they rope off an area, and I frickin' breakdance all day long, selling this shit. And I got a bunch of free stuff and like a little bit of money, and I did, 4 or 5 times. But I remember, check this out, I'm breakdancing in this little square, and I wore my blue jumpsuit, it's like a Run DMC suit. And I'm doing this, and of course I had really short hair at the time, right? And I got these kids that are really interested in it, and they're just buying this stuff up like crazy. It was funny. But then I had, because it's Kansas, it's in the middle of freaking farmland, I got these farmers in overalls, I shit you not, staring at me like, with just expressionless faces of like, what is this kid doing, right? I don't think they had any way of wrapping their mind around it, right? Pardon the pun. So, device-wise, we also got what's called the Walkman. And the Walkman was this little tiny cassette player, right? Because cassettes started taking over the industry. I think a cassette was $8.23. Because I used to work in electronics at Walmart. And so you would always save up $8.23 and you go buy your little cassette. And LL Cool J landed really quick. Walmart had this incredible distribution from New York. And you could get every single thing that the latest and greatest stuff on the coast were always being sold at Walmart, which was interesting. If they didn't have it, you would go 100 miles away to Wichita, Kansas, which is to the west, and you could get it at Camelot Records. So anything I couldn't get there, I would get at Camelot. And I remember, to this day, I have the original vinyl of the show and Lottie Dottie, and that was a funny story where I was programming at home. Or maybe I just got home or something, but my dad had just come back from Wichita. He liked to go look at cars and stereo stuff. My dad was huge into stereos. Oh my God. We had this, what's called a Macintosh stereo, which at the time was sort of like having a Lamborghini in your house when it comes to stereo equipment. Super expensive shit. I mean, in 1978, a full Macintosh stereo was about $8,000. A Corvette was less than that. Okay, just to put in perspective. So the front room always had the most amazing stereo, and I always had the kind of the hand-me-downs, which were better than most people's home stereos. And so I had 2 rooms with just incredible sound systems. My dad comes home, and he is flipping out. And he's like, dude, you got to hear this. You got to hear this. And he is like panicking to get this vinyl out of the freaking case, right? This is how cool my dad is. And at this point, I'd never heard him ever listen to anything rap-ish, right? He loved R&B, every single R&B band on planet Earth we owned. You had white music and black music in perfect quantities on both sides of the fence. And he pulls this damn album out. And for those of you who know the show, that's where Dougie Fresh got his debut. And he throws this thing on my turntable and plays this credible thing. It's like an Inspector Gadget theme. It's like da 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 da. And they had created this crazy, crazy song called The Show. And you had like 2 versions on it. One was the instrumental, and one was the rap. And it was Dougie Fresh doing all these mouth beats, right? I mean, like no one had ever heard that before, like a beatbox before. And Dougie Fresh was not only doing it, but he was doing it to this day better than most people can do it. He's kind of a corny guy today because he's from that nice era of the late 70s, early 80s. They don't have an evil bone in their body, right? But then you flip it over and you had Lottie Dottie with Slick Rick. And I got the original Fantasy Records vinyl. It's a black album with like splattered white paint all over it. It says Fantasy Records on it. So I'm very proud of that heirloom. I have the original print of it. First edition print of that album. He also had Thomas Dolby come out with She Blinded Me with Science, excuse me. And I've seen Thomas Dolby now, thanks to my friend Sebastian. He took me twice to various Thomas Dolby performances here in Los Angeles in the last, 5 years. So he's a brilliant man, and his music has a lot of background to it too, which is very interesting. So, anywhere you looked in the 80s, the music was phenomenal. Like, you had a hard time owning it all and playing it all because everything was amazing. Everything was original. There was no auto-tuning going on. Madonna did blow up in the 80s as well. But when Madonna blew up, whether or not we're right or not, she had the sense that she slept her way to the top. We didn't get the sense that this was a girl of any integrity. It was interesting. And I don't mean to slight her because I don't know her. And I don't know if any of that bullshit's true, but, you still had a lot of female performers that seemed to have integrity, like Pat Benatar, who married her guitar player and was just still owning it for quite a while. Blondie popped out right at the 80s, like 1980. Blondie hit hard. The Cars came out, massive band. To put in perspective, my dad's stereo system, when we moved to Massachusetts, we're sitting there, it's probably been late 80s, 81. And it was the first time I met an Indian guy, and we're doing some laundry. We're moving some stuff in at this apartment complex we were renting, and the door's open, and this kid walks by the door, and he notices my dad's Macintosh stereo system. And it's MC, not MAC. And the kid just freezes, and he looks in the door, and he goes, "Oh my God." He goes, "Is that a Macintosh system?" My dad's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Do you mind if I bring my favorite album down so I could hear it on your stereo?" My dad's like, "Sure, come on down, man." He's a really cool kid, very American, but he brings down the Cars. Never heard it in my life. Puts it in, and of course, it's like their first album, and it just kicks ass, and so became Cars fans too. Now, in the 80s, you also had sort of this controversial thing where Ronald Reagan our president at the time, got sort of involved with some covert projects were going on under his nose. He had no idea what was happening, and you had this guy, Ollie North, that was protecting the Iran-Contra situation where we were trading guns for drugs, and then we would take the drugs and distribute them at massive profits. So you might give away, I think the way the scam went is they would give away like $20,000 in guns, and they would get $200,000 or $300,000 in refined cocaine for it. Because the guns were so sanctioned, you couldn't just go to a store and buy an M16. The military had to give you these guns, otherwise you weren't going to have access to them. So these mob bosses, these drug cartel bosses, wanted that kind of arsenal without a problem, and they wanted it sanctioned by the government that made them. So, if you turned up with an M16 in a foreign country and America didn't give it to you, they might come down and take it away from you. So they wanted to have a partnership. Our intelligence agencies definitely wanted a lot of drugs. But this was something that most Americans knew nothing about. So that's why I'm not harping on the conspiracies of the 80s, because we didn't grow up in that, okay? So when that started hitting on the airwaves, most kids, we didn't get it. We figured government does these things, and this was so far removed from us that it just didn't penetrate our reality. So we didn't have a reason to be dark, So we cross over the mid-80s. Prince is still just owning the industry. The glam rock started getting a little silly. Once we got this band called Poison, and I met Bret Michaels last year, super nice guy, man. You had guys that were almost indistinguishable between girls and guys, right? With Motley Crue, you had sort of manly guys dressing up in sort of glamish stuff. RATT had calmed down and stopped dressing as feminine. You had David Lee Roth and RATT, Stephen Pearcy's lead singer. They were kind of always in spandex pants, really tight, But, it still felt manly because they sang badass songs, And Stephen Pearcy and RATT, one thing I like about them is that their music never ripped off the 50s as much. They really wrote their own riffs and their own stuff. And Motley Crue, that I love as well, they, a lot of it was just old blues stuff, kind of reprised, Smoking in the Boys' Room. It was just an old riff, dun 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 dun, So it's cool. But I just, for me, quality and excellence, that Lamborghini thing was in RATT and not in any other band at the time. But Cinderella came out pretty awesome. Wasp, I think, had some great tunes. And, of course, I am missing a ton of bands that came out. But we had this interesting thing. I moved to California in 87, as I've said a billion times on the show. Two interesting things occurred in 87. we had, well, I guess probably the most interesting thing to me personally was that LL Cool J had put out this album called Radio, which was pound for pound just one of the best. It was probably the best rap album up to that point. Just the density of lyrics, the cleverness. He had a whole gimmick to himself. He had a voice that sounded different than everyone's. My favorite couple tracks were, I think, Dear Yvette and Radio were my two favorites. But then he comes out with this album, this sequel called Bigger and Deffer. And I drove all the way to Wichita, Kansas to get this album because it was coming out. And I just wanted it the day it released. I don't even know how the hell I found that out. Because maybe I looked at the Walmart release dates or something. I don't know. But they didn't have it in Chanute yet. So I drive over and get this, and a couple of funny things occurred. I go and get this thing in Camelot Records, and I'm just dying to hear it. They weren't playing it inside the Camelot Records, so I didn't know what it sounded like. And I go back out to my car, and the first thing that happens, which just blows my mind to this day, I forget this ever happened, I had this Dodge Charger 1976 Special Edition, which basically looked like a Cordoba. Had all these engine problems and bad carburetor, bad starter. So I almost died a couple times in this car. But I take this cassette. Well, actually, what I did was I went back out to the parking lot. I put my key in my car. I sit down, and then I try to put the key in the. I put the key in the ignition. I turn it, and this car won't start. I'm thinking, oh shit! My car just died in the middle of Wichita, in the middle of the evening, middle of the summer. I'm over here by myself. There wasn't any like AAA to tow you 100 miles away, right? And then I realize I'm in someone else's car. Someone had parked the exact model of car right next to my car within like 20 feet, and I had gotten in the wrong car. But my key worked in their car, but it wouldn't turn the ignition. Thank God, I would have driven off with someone else's car. Grand Theft Auto, right? So I get freaked out because I'm like 17 years old, and I'm like, holy shit, I got to get out of here. So I get out of the guy's car, close the door. They didn't notice. Nobody came out, and I got in my car. And I put this cassette in, and I push play. And if any of you are familiar with this era, you had LL Cool J came out with a song called I'm Bad. And you've seen Jimmy Fallon do it on his show, and it's just a badass tune. So I put this thing in, and this track hits, and it was just one of those moments. If you've ever seen I think the premiere episode of Ren and Stimpy, there's a moment when Stimpy is watching the TV, and there's some high velocity commercial trying to sell something, and the voice gets up like this, like this, like this, and Stimpy just keeps sinking down in his thing just with anticipation. And as soon as the brand hits in the commercial, his head explodes. It's just like exactly what the marketing department wants to have happen. Well, that's what happened to me in this car. I heard this thing, and it was just phenomenal, this song. So I turn around the car, and I'm going home, and it's like a 2-hour drive home. And at the end of the album, what was funny to me was that it goes quiet, and you're thinking the thing's over, and I'm ready for it to rotate back around, I have this stereo in my car that doesn't have a knob for the volume switch, and, to reach down and touch the peg to turn it up. But also had this reverse thing, so you didn't have to take the cassette out and turn it around. But all of a sudden, I hear LL Cool J's voice, and he's like, hey, he goes, you don't think I could do it, did you? You didn't think I could beat the first album? He goes, well, the joke's on you, Jack, And at the end of that, I was thinking the exact same thing. I thought you blew yourself away, and I can't believe you beat your first album. So at the end of that album, he does this tribute sort of to himself, saying, we kicked, my crew and I, we kicked our own asses and we made a better album. And it's called Bigger and Deffer for that exact reason. So I ended up being a huge fan of his, again, all new tracks, all new crazy stuff. And then I moved to California. The way I moved to California was I had a kid from California move to Chanute, Kansas. And his father had invented, this is crazy, man, every one of you goes to a shopping center and now grabs a bag from a shopping center, from a Macy's, from a Bloomingdale's, and it has the cord that's attached to the bag, right? The rolled up cardboard cord that's attached to the bag. His father invented that. And so he moved his factory, I guess from Long Beach to Chanute, Kansas, because really, really cheap. And we had this old derelict train station thing that was a maintenance center for trains, and he just converted it. He created plastic bags, like the ones you pick up every single day, which was brand new in like 86, 87. And I met his son. And his son was like, well, I kind of dig your town, but I really like California a lot better. I was learning electric guitar from him, and at one point I sang for his band. Unfortunately, I didn't take it as serious as I should have. If I had done that, I mean, I can really sing, so I should have learned the lyrics a little bit better. But I was nerding out on my computer like crazy, creating tons of software, doing my thing, which ended up being my career, and painting and all this other stuff. But he wanted to do a trip to California. So what I ended up doing was I went in the June of 87. I came to California. We did this whole tour, and what was really nuts about it is we came right here to this town. One of the first towns we ever jumped into was Huntington Beach. What are the odds, right? I didn't move here. We did Huntington Beach, his girlfriend in Garden Grove, and then we drove up to Ventura and did the Jim Hall Racing course up there, which still exists to this day. It's Jim Hall Jr. Racing, son of Jim Hall, the inventor of the Formula race car. And I was able to get my lap times good enough that Jim came up to me and said, if you want a job, you're good enough that I can give you a job, because you need to not only maintenance the cars and you got to be able to teach you how to drive. And so you have to have a certain base level of driving capabilities, and it looks like you got it. I'm like, okay. And he goes, by the way, you say you're computer oriented, so why don't you take care of my inventory as well? So I said, cool. So I came back to Kansas, finished up my summer, asked my girlfriend at the time to move out with me, because she was giving me all this, like, I'm going to conquer the world, I'm going to move away. And I said, fine, I'm doing it, let's go. And she was like, oh, I was just kidding. Kind of funny. So then I hop in my car after my dad got married, and just by memory, just drove from Chanute all the way back to Ventura, drove right to his doorstep, August 19th. And the guy was like, oh, I didn't know you were going to come right back out. And I was like, yeah, I'm here. 2 months later. He's like, fine, you got the job. So I ended up squatting a room out there and worked for him for a couple months, like I've said a couple times, and then got a job working at the TurboTax people. All right, so now we're up to date. LL drops his third album. And ironically speaking, this kid from Queens, New York, right? St. Albans, Queens. He drops a track called Going Back to Cali. And it was, to this day, it might be one of the most original rap tunes ever created. And it's got this kind of wah-wah trumpet thing going on, and this muted trumpet thing, and it was just, I mean, all of you have most likely heard it, but it was massive, going back to Cali. And here I am in California, and my hero from New York has just done this whole thing about going to California, so I felt like I was in some serendipitous thing. Not little did I know that about 22 years later, I ended up working with him, and I'm still friends to this day. The reason why I wanted to jump you to 87 was that 87, 88 or so, you have this band coming out called Guns N' Roses. And I got friends who hate Guns N' Roses, which I just don't get it. Because they're pissing and moaning about some of the glam rock kind of destroying metal, and they like a lot of the older, they like the old hardcore rock. And so for me, Guns N' Roses was the very last thing that ever happened that was truly an homage to the rock and roll that really made the 80s possible. Rap was starting to get silly. And in America, we had, at the same time in 89, you had NWA, right? And just to quote their name, Niggers with Attitudes, right? Blowing up out of Compton. And, of course, that's created a whole arsenal of incredible rappers today. Ice Cube and Dre and Eazy-E that passed away. And even Tupac ran through that a little bit, I think. You also had Digital Underground coming out with the Humpty Dance and Do What You Like. All these 80s rock bands were still sucking on the last few fumes of their life, still filling up 20,000 people arenas in the LA Convention Center and around, Madison Square Gardens and that kind of stuff, still doing European tours. But the 80s still had us being, up until that point, 87 was a transitional point too for rap. People were happy, But you had Ice-T and a group called Eric B. and Rakim came out with, so Ice-T came out with Rhyme Pays, and what was Eric B.'s and Rakim's album? It was Paid in Full. That's what it was. I think that was their big track. And you also had, in the late 80s, Public Enemy coming out. The reason why I mention these bands specifically is you had this utter transformation from sort of your Walt Disney 80s, where everybody's algorithm was, let's talk about where we want to take society. Not where it is, but where we want it to be. Because the 80s was also full of the Bloods and the Crips. And so you had gang wars going on in the major ghettos. Every major city really, but mainly New York and Los Angeles. And you had these kids growing up in these horrific eras where the cops didn't know how to handle it. And so they started becoming really brutal with the people. Because, not every cop was in on the take, that drugs were being dropped in by the government. And so they just thought these kids were out of control, which obviously they were. But you had Ice-T was still kind of goofy, but still he started introducing sort of these stories about being a pimp, about being a drug dealer, and it was just hardcore. And, he would mix... I think it was Africa Bambaataa. He would make these beats for Ice-T with his Evil E DJ, and you had just these hardcore tracks. And so when we came to California on vacation, drove all the way back, we're listening to this, and it was a different transition. I got Eric B and Rakim. Took me a little while, but Rakim, the rapper, Eric B was the DJ. Eric B started debuting things like, jazzy, sort of smooth beats, and then Rakim was like this tough dude, and he never got gamey. He never was goofy and never did a comedy rap like LL Cool J was doing all kinds of things like Mr. Good Bars and that kind of stuff, which is actually his fourth album. But I totally missed the NWA thing. I did buy a Public Enemy album in the late 80s, and I could barely understand what the hell I was listening to, and I eventually became a massive fan of Terminator X and his whole thing. And Terminator X invented like this crazy, chaotic DJing that filled up, Bring the Noise and a bunch of other stuff for Public Enemy. I remember buying the Public Enemy album. I paid what I thought was an enormous amount of money. It was like somewhere between $11 and $14 for it, and I put it in. I listened to a couple tracks, and I just couldn't handle it. I remember putting the console in my car, and didn't pull it out for another year. And finally, I pulled it out and put it in. I really gave it some time, and it really just grew on me. I finally just got completely into Terminator X, But what I didn't realize was that this negativity had sort of, I guess, and culturally speaking, it needed to be exhausted. Right? There's an animator out there called Ralph Bakshi. And a lot of people don't know they know him, but they know him if you were part of the 70s and 80s. But Ralph Bakshi was an animator who was really disenfranchised with the Disney thing, because he said, all these cartoons, any cartoons that are made are always fluffy, and they're not what really happens in real life. And so he was creating Fritz the Cat. He created Heavy Traffic, which was, I think Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic both got a rating of X, which it's like porn, but it was essentially that he had so much TNA in his cartoons and violence. Oh my God, his violence was insane. Blood everywhere, crazy stuff. But he calmed down a little bit and created a movie called Wizards in 1977. There's a reason why I'm telling you this. Wizards came out, and it totally blew away everything he had done before, and everybody was kind of poo-pooing Ralph. Always independently created, and if you watch it, you may not dig it at all, but it came out a couple weeks before Star Wars. For the very first time, Ralph had the recognition that he always deserved, and there were lines around the block to see Wizards. Unfortunately, Star Wars came out either a week or two later, and you have to understand, if you're not part of that 1977 event called Star Wars, every theater removed every other movie and put Star Wars in, because they simply couldn't play it in enough theaters. The lines were on the block 24/7 for months and months and months. So Ralph's movie gets pulled, called Wizards. Well, the interesting thing was that Ralph, Tolkien's daughter, who wrote all the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit series, his daughter saw Wizards and said, she went to her father and said, Dad, you've kept Hollywood away from your book because you don't think anyone's going to do it justice. And she goes, I think I found the guy that can do it. So Ralph Bakshi was the first guy to ever animate or tell the story of the Tolkien franchise outside of the book. And so he ended up doing, I believe, Lord of the Rings first, and then Hobbit, which we now know Peter Jackson has now done the same exact thing. But in the 80s, Ralph did Cool World, which I wasn't a major fan of, but I believe it had Brad Pitt in it. It was one of his first acting jobs. And you had some moments in that movie too, where you had some risque things that occurred. But it wasn't until like Roger Rabbit that you had that woman that showed her crotch, just like in whatever that movie is that Sharon Stone did. I forget the name of it. But we also had in the late 80s, movie-wise, this explosion of real kind of action heroes, right? So we grew up with the Rockies in the late 70s, early 80s, right? I think Empire Strikes Back came out in 83, and so did Rocky 3. Because I remember standing in line for Return of the Jedi, and there was another line going in for Rocky 3. But in the late 80s, you had Arnold Schwarzenegger just utterly explode. And I had moved to California in 87. I think it was like Total Recall had come out, and Commando had come out, and I think Commando was filmed in the Sherman Oaks Galleria. You also had Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which was filmed in the Sherman Oaks Galleria. And for those of you who don't know, north in L.A., right as you're leaving the 405, you end up passing and getting onto the 101. And when you do that, there's this big mall over to the right called the Sherman Oaks Galleria. And it was the epicenter for filming movies. I mean, everyone filmed there. And so I went there once and looked around. It was kind of funny. But you also had Bruce Willis doing his Die Hard franchise. So you had all these incredible manly men that were our heroes at the late part of the 80s. But you also had this sort of, more gritty reality emerging in the late 80s, right? So by the time we got to the 90s, you had Spike Lee coming out with, Do the Right Stuff or Do the Right Thing, or can't remember, but a couple of movies where he was really bringing up this sentiment to the black community of America to really return to their African roots. And so you had this huge surge of sort of African clothing, sort of your almost Rastafarian colors, but it was sort of this really weird pseudo-African thing. And this is where we got the phrase African-American, where you were a bad person if you called a black person. Obviously, no one in the world is really black, but you also had Venice Beach, which like a lot of you guys are familiar with. Venice Beach was absolutely on fire in the 80s, and I remember going down several times from 87 to about 91 when I moved to the Bay Area. But Venice Beach looked exactly like the movie Breakin', which was filmed on Venice Beach. And you had all these performers down there. You had the guy that juggled chainsaws down there. You had a one-man band guy that would just owned it. He couldn't perform in the little blocks on the sidewalk. He had to perform right next to the chainsaw dude, where he would go out in the middle of this green area, and he had this one-man band thing on him, and the dude would play a bass guitar with his feet. He'd play saxophone with this thing, had the drums with his elbows and shit, and this guy was amazing. He played all these different songs. Sadly, I saw him 15 years later, and looks like crack cocaine got the best of him. And he was performing in this little 10-foot square, and was really kind of an angry guy at that point in his life, and he would spend about 75% of his performance yelling at the crowd to build a perfect crowd around him, and then he performed a little bit. Same old routine. It was kind of sad. But there was a dude down there called Michael Collier, who started in the late 80s and went up until the 90s, and even I think the first part of the 20th century. But he had an amazing rapport about him. He won this Ed McMahon's talent show eventually, I think in the 90s, and won $100,000 or something. He ended up investing in a nightclub and lived high on the hog for a little while, but ended up losing all of his money as well and getting strung out again. Tried to go back to Venice Beach and dominate, but he was past his era. But he had a really interesting racial thing I'll just leave you with, where he would he talk about how people call black people, and he said, he's a black guy, and he pull a few white people out of the crowd, and he'd stand them up, and he goes, he'd go grab a black purse off somebody in the audience. He goes, may I use your purse? And they'd say yes, and he goes, okay, what color is this? And they'd say black, and he pointed his face, and he goes, what color is this? And they'd say, oh, brown. And he goes, see, I'm not black, and you're calling me black person. And he goes, now what color is this guy? And he pointed to the white guy, and he'd point at the cheek, and he'd go, that's red, and this is white, and this is, all these different colors on a white person. He goes, you guys are coloreds, we're black, we're brown, really, we're not even black. And he would end his show with saying, there's only one race, there's the human race. And he goes, that's all we need to remember. We all need to get along, which I thought was great. And he was sort of the last bastion of thought of the 80s, which is why I want to end it there, because in the 80s, we had, 2, maybe 3 super genres of music. We had the sort of the glam rock, which is now affectionately called heavy metal, which is kind of funny. And then we had rap, which popped out, and we had the British pop scene pop out. Now, you did have bands like Metallica coming up in the same exact era, but they didn't really get any gameplay until the 90s, right? But they certainly had their game tight by the 90s coming around. So when you hear us anybody who lived in the 80s sort of piss and moan about the 80s being gone, about the 80s being this incredible era, hopefully this episode gives you a little bit of insight as to why we believe that was the case. Because as we went into the 90s, we really were pulling out the darkest moments of man and pushing them out there, which again, I can't see it didn't need to happen. It did change the game. Even Ice-T got really angry and did Cop Killer, and NWA, my God, they were all about the ghettos and police and if you were raised in the Midwest, where we didn't have a huge drug trade in the Midwest of any kind, and people didn't, the cops didn't have to deal with it. Our police officers were buying booze for the kids and then driving them home after they were drunk, and I remember one of my girlfriends actually wrecked a car driving home one night, and wrecked it into a parked car, and would have been a DUI, would have been a really embarrassing situation for her, but the police officers just said, get her home, we'll deal with this whole thing, you will pay for the damage on these cars and stuff, so you're gonna have to pay for everything that went wrong, but we understand, this kind of stuff happens. And because they knew they were embedded in buying kids booze, they kind of protected us. It was funny. I never had a cop buy me one, but we still walk into restaurants today, all over Southern California, and the music playing on the radio is 80s music. And you don't really hear restaurants full of 90s music. And I think it's because the overall tonal quality of the music is negative. It is sort of, the grunge thing was essentially dressing like you're poor. And everything was the tormented lives of privileged white people, And it doesn't mean the music's not fantastic, man. I mean, I own a ton of that music, and I definitely celebrated it, but it was always, I don't know, it was sort of, let's manifest about our defects. And there wasn't really a sentiment at the end of songs to say, and let's fix it, let's get to a better place. And so when those of us who grew up in that era, especially the 70s going into the 80s, and we see things like 9/11 happen, and we see things like the world losing its rights, and kids sort of, growing up and capitulating down to the negative future that they feel like they're forced to live in. This show is all about sort of reversing that. I don't know if I'm accomplishing that whatsoever, but the idea is to try and say, okay, guys, let's wake up and let's rekindle shooting for a goal that is positive, right? There's definitely a lot of great music out in every decade of life, but I think the quality of it is going down. I think that the number of kids actually picking up instruments might be rebounding just a little bit, because you see these videos of like 14-year-olds shredding guitars like Eddie Van Halen or Yngwie Malmsteen or something like that. So that's a bit encouraging that they're getting tired of their Facebook accounts, they're getting tired of their PlayStations. Luckily, these PlayStations are getting more and more expensive, and the economy's not getting any better. So buying a $75 game for a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox, whatever, it's a little tough to get up to those price points nowadays, because kids they're graduating with no jobs, as I go on about, right? Hopefully that was hopefully it's informative for those of you who didn't live in the 80s. For those of you who went through it, I couldn't have possibly, I'm almost at 2 hours now. I would have, it would have been really, really tough for me to go through every single minute detail. In terms of things that were negative in the 80s, I don't know. I guess I lived in a pocket where I didn't really see a tremendous amount of that. And I lived in a dirty, country town where, when it started snowing in late fall, and it was, there was snow up and down all over the roads for 5 to 6 months. Every car was filthy. Every house was filthy on the outside because you just couldn't clean it up. So I grew up in an era where it was like, things didn't look glamorous all the time, but our hearts, I think, were in the right place, and it just seemed like music was fueling, and movies were fueling these great frequencies in man. And when you fill up the heart of man in a mass way with positive thinking, then we look at war differently. We look at our futures differently. Because we had less choices in terms of what we did for a living, when you finally had to go to school, you just picked from a very small group of degrees and you got a job. It was just that simple. And if you didn't go to school like me, you still had a lot of pastimes because you didn't have the internet to guide you. You did have lots of game consoles and arcades and that kind of stuff. And arcades just got more and more crazy through the 80s. There was a point where kids were going to rehabilitation because they played too many arcade games. By at least 83, I remember the first story debuting that kids were playing so much that they weren't doing well at school, a bunch of stuff. But what's interesting about that is that the communities around the world swooped in and said, we have a standard of living, we have a standard of education, and these kids aren't getting that standard, so we're going to move in and help these kids out. I don't know, I think you feel me. I think you get it. I thought this would be just a nice diversion from all the other stuff, and I think it's unfair. One of the reasons why I want to make this episode is I think it's a little unfair to kids to hear about the 80s and not have someone just lay it on the line. You'll watch VH1 specials and that kind of stuff to get this kind of stuff, but I thought maybe this is a really weird channel to have someone bring it up. If it's just on VH1 or something, you may just skip over it. You mean like, it's just that old era that these old farts lived in, and they're always pissing and moaning it was better than our era, and I don't think anyone can really say it's better than a previous or better than a follow-up era or even a previous era. It was just really good for us, I would say. I do think that the unequivocal touch points, and this is the last thing I say before I close up with the bumper, the touch points of what I think those of us who lived through the 80s believe are the proof that the 80s had something going on that is now no longer here, was that the amount of kids that knew how to create art was at an utter peak. The amount of movies that came out of the 80s that were legendary, that swept up society and said, you got to go. And you don't want to see this at your home through a DVD or a VHS tape. You want to see this in the movie theater because it's only good in there. That's where you truly get the absolute experience of it. Was super duper high. We have seen since the 80s, that the arts be defunded in schools. So if you're able to play an instrument in school, you're lucky. If you learn how to draw or paint, you're lucky. If you learn how to program, you're lucky. It's just much tougher to get these skills because the schools have had their departments defunded. And what's that going to leave you with? A consumeristic society, right? I can definitely tell you unequivocally, without a shadow of a doubt, the utter happiness and hopefulness of kids in the 80s is 2 to 4 times what it is today. You had the surge in depression drugs in the 90s, which is still lasting to this day. And it's because kids see reasons to be depressed. Today we wake up with, I don't know, how many enemy factions that are supposed to be chasing your culture around, right? We didn't have that. We didn't wake up with this notion the Arabs are going to come kill us. Even when Arabs were portrayed in Back to the Future, the movie, of being the driving force to get, Doc, to go back in time and fix things, we didn't take it seriously. No one thought, these Arabs are real and they're going to really get us. It was just they had to pick an enemy, and they picked one that was definitely mysterious to us. And so, whatever, it was in and out in the first act, maybe 3 to 5 minutes of shooting up the VW van. It wasn't a big deal. And now we live in that constantly. So if any of you are at the cusp of trying to re-engineer the present, I think that this episode might give you a bird's eye view. Our men were men, and they were heroes, and they behaved like men. They diffused violence as much as they engaged in it. They had wisdom. And I think today it's sort of like it's sort of a sentiment of futility. Well, everything sucks and you're going to die eventually. That kind of sort of feeling, I think, is what I get out of a lot of kids. And kids are very fragile today because they see so much violence, and what are they going to do? What are they going to do about that violence? They can't really do much. Can't do much with it, but just get to the next day. And the economies are up and down like crazy now. And as much as I think the 80s economy was actually pretty darn good. We did have the savings and loan scandal in the 80s, but that was really at a banker level. It didn't really take money out of parents' pockets. Where now it absolutely hits the core every 6 to 8 years, where people get all their money taken away from them. They lose their houses and they lose their futures, and kids can't go to school without borrowing money. When I moved to California in 87, I could take infinite credits for $50. $50. I could take infinite credits because it was subsidized by the state. You can't do that anymore. It was junior college, but come on, you could get so many credits in a junior college that by the time you went to your 4-year, you only take about a year and a half, and you could get your four-year degree. So you're only paying maybe $10,000-$15,000, and you had your degree in your pocket. So those are loans that you can pay off. That makes complete sense. $20,000 to get a college education. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, it's still a lot of money, but you can pay that off over 10, 15 years at zero interest, right? Like the payment every month for our last girlfriend that had $15,000 in. She graduated 6 years of college. She only had $15,000 in debt. She got she got a job exactly in her degree. She's been doing it ever since, and she's amazing. But one of her parents took $5,000, another parent took the other $5,000, and she took the other $5,000. The payment every month, I think, was $50. Big deal. It's doable, and that's the way it was. So let's see what we can do about maybe splicing the DNA from the past into the future. It's going to have to require some wake-up calls and getting rid of paradigms that have been usurping our reality, taking over our consciousness. But that's from one 46-year-old guy to whoever the hell's listening. Hopefully that's helpful to you guys. If you want a better life for your kids, then I would say go study the anatomy of the 80s. As soon as your kid can engage a hobby that's employable, drawing, painting, playing an instrument, learning computers, whatever you can teach them skill-wise, teach them. Teach them, get them hobbies, because by the time they need to turn that into a major in college, they'll actually be at 18, they'll know what the hell they want to do with their life. You never know. I got to 18 and I had enough skills at 18 to get into a company that wanted degrees. It's still possible to this day. You just got to have the focus to pull it off. ADHD and ADD, well, that's not really a physical ailment of your child. That's just mental conditioning of short attention span theater stuff like Facebook and video games and all that stuff, right? All those things are okay as long as they're engaged in moderation. But I think that if you're strung out on it, the only way to get past it is to go cold turkey on that stuff for a little while and kind of smell the flowers and get some sunlight on your face like I'm doing right now. Engage in some pretty good conversations with your kids. If you are a kid and you're listening to this, well, there's a beacon of archaeological information that might give you the advantage over everyone else in your class. I know you feel me. Man, if you made it into this one, this is a long one. Didn't expect it to go 2 hours. Thanks for listening. As always, mkultraradio.com for all the feeds. Again, there's a separate Facebook for Deep Thoughts now. It's facebook.com/deepthoughtsradio. If you're coming to the video, there is a podcast to this whole thing. I will say that there was my Star Trek episode that I mixed down for the podcast. I guess I'd never listened to it. I usually go back and listen to it to make sure the sound level's okay. It's atrociously high. So before this goes out, I will remix that down so it's not all fuzzy and distorted. Thank God I mix those things out before I throw them away. But as always, thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and somebody else. Hopefully this is helpful to you guys, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.